He broke her. He did it methodically, citing duty and title, leaving her weeping in a rain-soaked garden exactly 1 year ago. He thought he had buried the memory. He thought his heart was as dead as his conscience. But then the heavy oak doors to the Wyndham Ballroom opened. The string quartet faltered. The whispers died. She stepped inside, forged in the fire of his betrayal. If you've ever had to face the ghost of your own terrible choices, listen closely. The Wyndham Ball was a suffocating affair. It always was. The Duke of Westford, Nathaniel Hastings, stood near the edge of the room, his back pressed against a cold marble pillar, watching the aristocracy of London sweat through their silks. The air was thick with the smell of melting beeswax, expensive Parisian perfume, and the desperate, sharp scent of ambition. Nathaniel hated it all. He hated the mothers parading their daughters like prize mares. He hated the fathers calculating dowries in their heads while shaking his hand. Most of all, he hated the hollow, rhythmic thud of his own heart. He took a sip of his brandy. It was warm. He swallowed it anyway, welcoming the burn. It had been 365 days, a full year since he had done the most necessary, cowardly thing of his life. He had spent the last 12 months convincing himself that survival required cruelty. The Hastings estate had been bleeding money for 2 generations. He had inherited a massive, crumbling legacy and a ledger full of debts. When he looked at his future, he saw ruin. So, he had cut off the only part of his life that didn't serve a pragmatic purpose. He had cut off Cecilia. He shifted his weight, his jaw clenching as a passing dowager offered him a simpering smile. He gave her a curt nod, enough to satisfy politeness, not enough to invite conversation. He just wanted the clock to strike midnight so he could retreat to his carriage, return to his cavernous, empty house, and sleep the heavy, dreamless sleep of the damned. Then the noise stopped. It didn't happen all at once. It started near the grand entrance at the top of the sweeping double staircase. The footman, who usually possessed lungs of leather to announce the arriving guests, simply stopped speaking mid-breath. The silence bled downward, trickling through the crowd like ice water. First, the laughter ceased. Then the polite murmurs. Finally, the string quartet, noticing the sudden void in the room, let their bows stutter and drag across the strings in a discordant, dying note. Nathaniel pushed off the pillar. He frowned, his eyes scanning the sea of heads. The crowd parted. They didn't just step aside. They recoiled, pulling their skirts and coattails back as if making way for royalty, or a ghost. At the top of the stairs stood Cecilia Marlowe. Nathaniel stopped breathing. The sensation was immediate and violent. It felt as though someone had driven a heavy, blunt iron spike directly through his ribs. His fingers tightened around his crystal glass, the pressure so immense the glass whined in protest. She wasn't the girl he had left in the rain. That girl had worn soft pinks and creams, her hair falling in unruly curls around a face that wore every emotion like a beacon. That girl had looked at him as if he hung the moon and the stars. The woman standing at the top of the stairs wore a gown of midnight blue, so dark it looked like a bruise. It lacked the excessive ruffles and lace favored by the season's debutantes. It was slashed low across her collarbones, severe, architectural, and unapologetic. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, gleaming knot, exposing the long, pale line of her neck, but it was her eyes that pinned Nathaniel to the floor. She looked over the crowd with a bored, brittle indifference. She wasn't seeking approval. She wasn't looking for friends. She was surveying a conquered territory. Beside him, Lord Rutledge let out a low, vulgar whistle. "God in heaven," the older man muttered. "Is that the Marlowe girl? The one whose father bought that fleet of merchant ships?" Nathaniel couldn't speak. His throat was filled with sand. They say she's worth £100,000 now, Rutledge continued, entirely oblivious to the fact that Nathaniel looked ready to commit murder. And entirely unattached, though I hear she's colder than a banker's heart. Cecilia began to descend the stairs. She didn't look down at her feet. She didn't hold on to the banister. She moved with a liquid, predatory grace, her silk skirts making a dry, whispering sound against the marble steps that seemed to echo in the absolute silence of the ballroom. As she reached the floor, the crowd surged inward, eager to swallow her up, to claim her time, to orbit the newest, brightest, richest star in London. But for a fraction of a second, before the sea of bodies obscured her, Cecilia's gaze flicked across the room. It cut through the dim, candle-lit haze. It bypassed the eager young lords, the calculating matrons, and the whispering gossips. Her eyes found Nathaniel's. There was no shock, no pain, no lingering affection. She looked at him, the way one might look at a mildly uninteresting piece of furniture before looking away. The glass in Nathaniel's hand shattered. Brandy and blood dripped onto the polished floor. He didn't feel the cut. He felt nothing but the devastating, hollow realization that he had not just broken her heart. He had killed the only woman who had ever loved him, and a stranger was wearing her skin. A footman was there in an instant, offering a white linen cloth. Nathaniel took it without looking, wrapping it tight around his bleeding palm. The sting of the alcohol in the cut was a distant, dull ache compared to the roaring in his ears. "Nasty business, Glass," Lord Rutledge offered, finally noticing. "Yes," Nathaniel rasped. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Excuse me." He turned and walked away. He needed air. He needed space. But the Wyndham Ballroom was designed for entrapment. He wove through the throng of people, his height giving him a clear view of the room, a view he desperately did not want. Everywhere he looked, he saw the ripple effect of her presence. The room had resumed its noise, but the pitch was higher, more frantic. The orchestra had struck up a waltz, playing a little too fast. He found a shadowed alcove near the terrace doors and leaned against the velvet-draped wall, hiding his bleeding hand behind his back. From here, he could watch her. He couldn't stop himself. It was a morbid compulsion, like pressing on a fresh bruise to see how deep the pain went. She was surrounded. Lord Harrison, a notoriously arrogant viscount, was currently bowing over her gloved hand. Nathaniel watched Harrison's lips move, likely delivering some practiced, oily compliment. A year ago, Cecilia would have blushed. She would have stammered, looked down at her shoes, and desperately searched the room for Nathaniel to rescue her. Now she simply tilted her head. She offered Harrison a smile that was entirely localized to her lips. It was a sharp, practiced curve that held no warmth whatsoever. She withdrew her hand smoothly, said a single sentence that made Harrison's confident smirk falter, and turned her back on him. Nathaniel swallowed hard. The memory of their parting assaulted him. He tried to push it away, but her physical presence in the room dragged it to the surface, violent and vivid. It had been his study. The fire had been dying in the grate. She had come to him, soaking wet from a sudden downpour, laughing, carrying a book she thought he might like. She was always trying to bring light into his gloomy, cavernous life. He had stood behind his heavy mahogany desk, using it as a barricade. He had looked at her wet, smiling face, and he had driven the knife in. This must end, Cecilia. He remembered how her laugh had died, how the book had slipped from her fingers, hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud. "Nathaniel, I don't understand." He hadn't raised his voice. He had been clinically precise. He told her about his debts. He told her about his duty to the Westford title. He told her that affection was a luxury a duke on the edge of bankruptcy could not afford. He told her she was a distraction. He hadn't told her that he was terrified. He hadn't told her that his father had loved a woman so much it broke his mind when she died, leaving him a hollow shell who gambled away the family fortune to feel something. Nathaniel had grown up swearing he would never be beholden to a feeling that could destroy him. "You are breaking my heart because of a ledger?" she had asked, her voice trembling, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I am securing my future," he had replied, cold as stone. She had stared at him for a long, terrible minute. The desperate hope in her eyes had slowly died, replaced by a profound, agonizing grief. "You have no future, Nathaniel," she had whispered. "You are already dead." Then she had walked out into the rain. He hadn't gone after her. Now, standing in the shadows of the ballroom, Nathaniel watched her accept a dance from the Earl of Somerset. Somerset was young, handsome, and wildly wealthy. He was everything Nathaniel was supposed to be and wasn't. They took the floor. Nathaniel's eyes tracked every movement. Cecilia danced with flawless, mechanical precision. Her posture was perfect. She moved through the intricate steps of the quadrille without ever truly looking at her partner. She was a phantom. She occupied space. She moved. She spoke. But the core of her, the vibrant, pulsing, messy life that had drawn Nathaniel to her in the first place, was completely gone. He had done that. He had taken a girl who felt everything and turned her into a woman who felt nothing. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until his lungs burned. He watched Somerset lean in, whispering something in her ear, trying to bridge the icy gap she kept between them. Cecilia merely arched a brow, her face an unreadable mask. She was untouchable. Nathaniel realized, with a sickening jolt, that he wasn't just feeling guilt. He was feeling possessive jealousy, sharp and acidic. He had no right to it. He had thrown her away. Yet, watching another man hold her waist, watching another man try to make her smile, made him want to tear the ballroom down to the foundation stones. The music swelled, reaching its crescendo. The couples separated, bowed and curtsied. Cecilia stepped away from Somerset. She declined his offer to escort her to the refreshment tables with a slight shake of her head. She turned and began to walk. She was heading toward the terrace doors, toward the alcove where Nathaniel stood hidden in the shadows. He froze. He could have stepped back. He could have slipped out the side door and vanished into the night, preserving the pathetic, miserable existence he had carved out for himself. But his feet wouldn't move. The gravitational pull of her was too strong. He let the blooded napkin drop from his hand to the floor. He stepped out of the shadows, placing himself directly in her path. She didn't startle. As she approached the shadows of the alcove, her pace didn't slow. She saw him stepping into the dim light, his broad shoulders blocking the way to the cool night air of the terrace. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough that the scent of her reached him. It wasn't the sweet lavender she used to wear. It was something sharper now. Bergamot, smoked wood, and something dark and unfamiliar. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cacophony of the ballroom raged behind them. The clinking of glasses, the shrieking laughter, the scraping of violins. But in the 3 feet of space between Nathaniel and Cecilia, there was a vacuum. Nathaniel looked at her face. Up close, the transformation was even more devastating. The softness of her youth had been burned away, leaving sharp, aristocratic angles. Her cheekbones were high and hollow, her lips painted a severe red. But it was her eyes that ruined him. They were the same striking grey, but the light behind them had been extinguished. They were like looking into a winter sky just before a storm. Cold, vast, empty. "Cecilia," he said. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "Your Grace," she replied. Her voice didn't waver. It was smooth, modulated, and entirely devoid of inflection. It was the tone one might use to address a shopkeeper who had given the wrong change. The formality hit him like a physical blow. A year ago, she had called him Nathaniel. She had whispered it against his neck. She had laughed it across a crowded room. "You returned to London," he managed to say, cursing his own clumsiness. He sounded like a fool, a stammering boy. "I did," she said simply. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't fill the silence. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped lightly in front of her dark blue skirts. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He was drowning, and she was watching him go under from the shore. "You look—" He swallowed, his throat working. He couldn't say beautiful. Beautiful was too small a word. "You look different. Time passes, Your Grace. People adapt." Her gaze flicked down to his hand. The cut on his palm had stopped bleeding, but the edges were red and angry. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before bringing her eyes back to his face. She offered no sympathy. She didn't ask if he was well. "I heard about your father's success," Nathaniel said, desperate to keep her standing there, desperate for any tether to her, even a conversational one. "The shipping ventures. Congratulations." "Thank you. He is very pleased." "Money," she said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, taking on a razor-sharp edge, "solves a great many inconveniences. As you well know." He flinched. He couldn't help it. The barb was delivered so smoothly, without a trace of malice or anger. It was just a statement of fact, which made it cut infinitely deeper. "Cecilia, Miss Marlowe," she corrected him. Her tone didn't raise, but the finality in it was absolute. "Miss Marlowe," he conceded, feeling a humiliating heat rise in his neck. I did not expect to see you here tonight." "I am sure you did not. But London is small, and avoiding one another forever is a statistical impossibility. We are bound to occupy the same rooms. We will occasionally breathe the same air." She looked past him, toward the open terrace doors. "If you will excuse me, I find the heat in here rather oppressive." She took a step forward, intending to walk around him. Panic, hot and entirely unfamiliar, flared in Nathaniel's chest. He couldn't let her walk away. Not like this. Not with this terrible, polite indifference. He would prefer her screaming. He would prefer her slapping him. Anger meant there was still fire. Apathy meant there was only ash. He shifted, blocking her path again. It was a boorish, ungentlemanly move. He didn't care. "Please," he said, and he hated the raw, jagged edge of begging in his own voice. "Just a moment." Cecilia stopped. She looked up at him. The physical proximity was agonizing. He was close enough to see the steady rise and fall of her chest, close enough to see the tiny, imperceptible pulse beating at the base of her throat. "A moment for what exactly?" she asked, her brow furrowed slightly, feigning mild confusion. "Have we business to discuss, Duke? Does the Westford estate require a loan?" He closed his eyes, taking the hit. No. Then what could we possibly have to say to one another? He opened his eyes. He looked down into the face of the woman he had destroyed. "I want to know how you are." A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of her painted lips. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. "How I am," she repeated. "You wish to know how I am?" "Yes." She tilted her head, studying him as if he were a specimen pinned to a board. "I am exceedingly well, Your Grace. I sleep soundly. I eat well. I attend the theatre. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and I am entirely unburdened by the foolish, childish illusions I held a year ago." She leaned in, just an inch. The scent of bergamot and smoke surrounded him. "You did me a great favor," she whispered, her voice a soft, dry rasp. "You taught me that the heart is a liability. It is a useless, fragile organ that only gets in the way of survival. I had mine removed. It was a bloody process, but I assure you, the recovery was worth it. Nathaniel felt his breath hitch. His right hand, the cut one, twitched at his side, desperate to reach out, to grab her shoulders, to shake her, to hold her, to do something, anything to crack the porcelain mask she wore. "You don't mean that," he said thickly. "I assure you, I do." She stepped back, restoring the distance between them. The smile vanished, leaving her face as blank and beautiful as a marble statue. "Now I truly must insist you step aside. I require air, and you are blocking the draft." She didn't wait for him to move. She stepped around him, the silk of her midnight blue gown brushing against the rough wool of his trousers. The friction sent a phantom shockwave up his leg. He stood frozen in the alcove, listening to the soft, rhythmic tap of her heels on the terrace stones as she walked out into the night. He had expected her hatred. He had prepared himself for her scorn. He had spent a year bracing for the moment she would look at him with loathing. He hadn't prepared for her to look at him as if he were nothing at all. Nathaniel turned his head, looking out into the darkness where she had disappeared. The ballroom behind him felt suddenly, impossibly cold. He realized then the true extent of his arrogance. He had thought he had broken her heart to save himself, but watching her stand in the moonlight, a beautiful, hollowed-out monument to his own cowardice, Nathaniel knew the truth. He hadn't saved himself. He had damned them both, and the punishment was only just beginning. Westford House was a mausoleum. It had always been grand, boasting high-vaulted ceilings and walls lined with the severe, oil-painted faces of Nathaniel's ancestors. But in the week following the Wyndham Ball, the grandeur felt distinctly oppressive. The house absorbed light and sound, returning only a hollow, biting chill. Nathaniel sat in his study. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, allowing the anemic London sunlight to wash over the massive mahogany desk. This was the room where he had ended it. He still avoided looking at the faded patch on the Persian rug near the fireplace, the exact spot where Cecilia's book had struck the floor. His hand throbbed. The cut from the shattered brandy glass had scabbed over, a tight, angry line across his palm that pulled every time he flexed his fingers. He welcomed the sting. It was a tangible, grounding pain that distracted him from the yawning void in his chest. Across the desk sat Mr. Dawson, the estate manager. Dawson was a man constructed entirely of sharp angles and pessimistic ledgers, his spectacles perpetually sliding down his thin nose. He had been speaking for 10 minutes. Nathaniel hadn't processed a single word. "Which brings us to the Ashdown lease, Your Grace," Dawson said, tapping an ink-stained finger against a column of numbers. Nathaniel blinked, dragging his focus back to the present. "The Ashdown lease. Yes. The tin mines in Cornwall. The current lease expires at the end of the month," Dawson said, peering over his spectacles. "The consortium holding it is dissolving. It goes to open auction on Thursday. We must acquire it, Your Grace. The revenue from Ashdown has kept the Westford estate afloat for the past year. Without it, the structural repairs to the north wing will have to halt, and the creditors in the city will begin asking very uncomfortable questions." Nathaniel rubbed his temples. A dull headache had taken up permanent residence behind his eyes. "We have the capital for the auction?" "Barely," Dawson admitted, his voice dropping to a grim murmur. "I have liquidated the remaining consols and called in the minor debts from the tenant farmers. We can bid up to £12,000. It is a steep price, but it is an investment in survival." Survival. The word tasted rancid. Nathaniel had sacrificed the only pure, decent thing in his life on the altar of survival. And here he was, still scrambling, still bleeding out slowly over ledgers and leases. "Very well," Nathaniel said, his voice flat. "Prepare the drafts. I will attend the auction myself." Dawson hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. "There is another matter, Your Grace. A rumor from the city regarding the Marlowe Syndicate." Nathaniel's head snapped up. The headache vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense spike of adrenaline. "What about them?" "They have been uncommonly aggressive this quarter," Dawson said, lowering his voice as if the walls were listening. "Arthur Marlowe is technically the head, of course, but the whisper on Threadneedle Street is that he is merely rubber-stamping the decisions. The true architect of the syndicate's recent acquisitions is his daughter." Nathaniel leaned back slowly. The leather of his chair creaked in the quiet room. "Cecilia. Miss Marlowe, yes. She operates through a network of brokers, naturally, to preserve appearances. But the strategy bears her signature. It is brilliant and entirely ruthless." Dawson swallowed hard. "She bought out the textile mills in Manchester last month. When the workers threatened a strike, she didn't negotiate. She fired the instigators, doubled the wages of those who stayed, and broke the union in 3 days. They say she watched the proceedings from her carriage, drinking tea." Nathaniel stared at the inkwell on his desk. He tried to reconcile the image of the woman Dawson was describing with the girl who used to cry over injured sparrows in his garden. He couldn't. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. "Why are you telling me this, Dawson?" "Because," the manager said quietly, "the Marlowe Syndicate has recently shown a sudden, intense interest in raw materials, coal, iron, and tin." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Nathaniel stood up. He walked to the window, looking out over the manicured, lifeless grounds of his estate. The sky was the color of bruised iron. "She wouldn't," Nathaniel muttered, more to himself than to Dawson. "It makes no geographical sense for their shipping lines. Transporting tin from Cornwall to their northern ports would eat the profit margins." "Profit may not be the primary motivator, Your Grace," Dawson suggested gently. Nathaniel gripped the windowsill. He remembered the look in Cecilia's eyes on the terrace. "I had mine removed. It was a bloody process, but I assure you, the recovery was worth it." She wasn't seeking revenge. Revenge was an act of passion. Revenge meant you cared. What Cecilia was doing was pest control. "Prepare the 12,000, Nathaniel said, turning back to the room. His voice was hard, stripped of its previous exhaustion. "If she wants a war over a ledger, she will find I am vastly more experienced in the mud." The London Exchange was a cathedral of greed. Men in dark broadcloth coats clustered beneath the soaring glass ceiling, their voices a continuous, low-level roar that smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and desperation. Nathaniel stood near the front of the auction block. He hated these rooms. He hated the public display of financial endurance. But the Ashdown lease was the difference between holding his family's legacy and watching it be carved up by vultures. He kept his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic boredom. Inside, his stomach was a tight knot of acid. He scanned the room, his eyes darting through the crowd, looking for a glimpse of midnight blue silk. She wasn't on the floor. Women rarely were. If Cecilia was here, she would be in the private galleries above, hidden behind the velvet drapes, pulling strings from the dark. The auctioneer, a stout man with a booming theatrical voice, struck his wooden gavel. "Gentlemen, we move to Lot 42, the leasehold for the Ashdown Tin Mines, Cornwall. Bidding commences at £5,000. The room quieted. This was a heavy asset. The minor players stepped back, leaving the floor to the industrial barons and the desperate aristocracy. 5,000, called a voice to Nathaniel's left. Lord Rutledge. The man had more money than sense, and loved to inflate prices purely for sport. 6, Nathaniel counted smoothly, not looking at Rutledge. 7, said a broker near the back. 8, Rutledge chimed in, grinning around a wet cigar. 9, Nathaniel said. The knot in his stomach tightened. They were climbing too fast. The bidding ping-ponged across the room for 2 agonizing minutes. Rutledge dropped out at 10,000 with a dramatic sigh. The broker at the back pushed it to 11. 12, Nathaniel said. His voice echoed slightly in the sudden quiet. 12. His absolute ceiling. The last drop of blood in the Westford veins. The auctioneer looked around the room. The silence stretched. The broker at the back shook his head, folding his arms. £12,000, the auctioneer called out. Going once, going twice. Nathaniel let out a slow, silent breath. He unclenched his jaw. He had it. He had secured the estate for another 5 years. He could breathe. 15,000. The voice didn't come from the floor. It came from the gallery above. It was a man's voice, crisp, bored, and amplified by the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling. Nathaniel froze. The blood drained from his face, pooling in his boots. He slowly tipped his head back, looking up at the private boxes. Standing at the railing of box number 4 was a young, sharp-suited broker. He held a small, numbered paddle. Behind him, seated in the shadows of the box, was a figure in a dark, tailored riding habit. A woman. She leaned forward, just enough for the gaslight to catch the severe angles of her face and the gleam of her silver-pinned hair. Cecilia. She looked down at Nathaniel. She didn't smile. She didn't sneer. She looked at him with the mild curiosity of someone watching a horse break its leg on a track. The room erupted into frantic whispers. 15,000 was a massive overbid. It was financially absurd. It was an execution. £15,000 is bid from the gallery, the auctioneer shouted over the noise, wiping sweat from his brow. Do I hear 16? Your Grace? The auctioneer looked directly at Nathaniel. The entire room looked at Nathaniel. He stood, paralyzed. He could feel the eyes boring into his back. He opened his mouth, but his throat was sealed shut. He had nothing left. He was empty. To bid 16,000 would mean pledging the house itself. It would mean ruin. He looked up at the gallery. Cecilia picked up a small opera glass from the ledge and raised it to her eyes, examining the architecture of the ceiling. She had just destroyed his future, and she was bored. Nathaniel swallowed the bitter, metallic taste of defeat. He gave a sharp, definitive shake of his head to the auctioneer. Going once, twice, sold. The gavel slammed down with the finality of a coffin lid. To the Marlowe Syndicate. The roar of the room resumed, louder now, fueled by the fresh gossip of a duke falling to merchant money. Nathaniel didn't wait. He turned on his heel and carved a path through the crowd. Men stepped aside, their expressions a mix of pity and predatory satisfaction. He burst through the heavy brass doors of the exchange and out onto the steps. The air was thick, heavy with impending rain. He stood at the top of the marble steps, his breathing shallow and rapid. He felt a terrifying, burning pressure behind his eyes. He hadn't just lost a mine. He had lost his justification. He had broken her to save his estate. Now, she had taken the estate anyway. His betrayal had been entirely, utterly pointless. He heard the click of heels on the marble. He turned. The side doors of the exchange, reserved for the occupants of the private galleries, had opened. Cecilia emerged, flanked by her broker and a towering footman holding a large black umbrella. She paused at the top of the stairs, pulling on a pair of soft grey leather gloves. She didn't look surprised to see him standing there, vibrating with contained rage. Nathaniel crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. The footman stepped forward, lifting a heavy hand, but Cecilia waved him off with a flick of her wrist. "Dismissed, Hughes," she said to the broker without looking at him. "Wait by the carriage." The men retreated down the steps, leaving Nathaniel and Cecilia alone on the landing under the heavy, bruised sky. 15,000, Nathaniel said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. It isn't worth 10. You'll never recoup the investment. Cecilia finished smoothing the leather of her left glove. The syndicate operates on a longer timeline than the Westford estate, Your Grace. We can afford to take a temporary loss to secure a monopoly in the region. Don't lie to me, he snapped, stepping closer. The scent of bergamot and smoke hit him again, twisting the knife in his gut. This isn't about regional monopolies. This is about me. Cecilia finally looked up. Her grey eyes were flat and unblinking. You have a remarkably high opinion of your own relevance, Duke. You overpaid by £5,000 just to watch me choke. I overpaid to ensure a swift close to the bidding so I might make my luncheon appointment at 1 o'clock, she replied smoothly, pulling a silver pocket watch from her jacket, which I am currently in danger of missing. Cecilia, stop, he pleaded, the anger bleeding out of him, replaced by a desperate, crushing exhaustion. Just stop. You won. You have the money. You have the power. You humiliated me in front of half of London. If this is punishment, I accept it. But don't stand there and tell me it's just business. She studied him. For a fraction of a second, the perfect porcelain mask faltered. A muscle in her jaw feathered. Her eyes narrowed, shedding their bored indifference to reveal a sudden, terrifying flash of pure, cold rage. Punishment? She asked softly. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut over the noise of the London street traffic below them. You think I spent £15,000 to punish you? Yes, she laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that held absolutely zero humour. Nathaniel, to punish you, I would have to care what happens to you. I would have to lie awake at night, plotting your downfall. I would have to invest emotional energy into your ruin. She stepped toward him. He didn't retreat. She stopped mere inches away, looking up into his eyes. I bought the Ashdown lease because it secures a supply chain for my ships, she said, enunciating every word with clinical precision. When Mr. Hughes informed me you were the primary competitor, I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I felt absolutely nothing. You were merely an obstacle in a ledger, and like all obstacles you were removed. It was nothing personal. The words were a physical blow, a brutal, breathless strike to his solar plexus. If she had screamed at him, slapped him, cursed his name to the heavens, he could have fought back. He could have apologized. He could have groveled. But this absolute, chilling insignificance. It was a fortress he had no weapons to breach. You are lying, he whispered, searching her eyes for any trace of the girl who had loved him. He found only ice. Believe whatever comforts you, Your Grace, she said, stepping back. The flash of anger was gone, replaced once again by the flawless, impenetrable facade. Now, I bid you good day. It is going to rain, and silk is terribly difficult to dry. The first drop hit the marble steps as she turned away. It was heavy and cold. Nathaniel watched her walk down the stairs toward her waiting carriage, a lacquered black monstrosity with the Marlowe crest gleaming in gold on the door. Her footman held the umbrella over her, shielding her from the sudden, aggressive downpour. The rain began to fall in sheets, bouncing off the cobblestones, turning the London streets into a grey, blurred watercolour. The noise of it drowned out the carriages and the shouts of the street vendors. Nathaniel stood at the top of the stairs, unprotected. The cold water soaked through his coat in seconds, plastering his hair to his forehead. He didn't feel it. He was transported back to his study 1 year ago. The sound of the rain was exactly the same. The drumming on the glass, the smell of wet earth. He had stood behind a desk and watched her walk out into a storm. He looked at her now, halfway down the stairs. She was moving away from him, protected, dry and entirely unreachable. A primal, violent desperation seized him. He couldn't let it end like this. He couldn't let the ledger close. He ran down the stairs. His boots slipped on the wet marble, but he caught himself, practically vaulting down the final few steps. "Cecilia!" he shouted over the roar of the rain. She was just reaching the carriage. The footman had the door open. She paused, one foot on the iron step, and turned her head. Nathaniel closed the distance, stopping just outside the perimeter of the umbrella. Water streamed down his face, soaking his expensive cravat, ruining his tailoring. He looked like a madman. He didn't care. "What now, Duke?" she asked, sighing slightly. "Do you require a loan for a cab?" He reached out and grabbed the edge of the carriage door, holding it open. The footman bristled, stepping forward, but Cecilia raised a hand, stopping him. "I was a coward," Nathaniel said. The words tore out of his throat, jagged and bloody. "I was a terrified, arrogant coward." Cecilia's expression remained unchanged. She looked at his hand, gripping the black lacquer of the door, the rain washing over his knuckles. "We established this a year ago. It is hardly breaking news. I thought I had to choose." He pressed on, ignoring her sarcasm, fighting to keep her eyes on his. "I looked at the debts, I looked at my father's ruin, and I panicked. I convinced myself that keeping the title alive was the only thing that mattered. I convinced myself that love was a luxury that would drag us both down. A very pragmatic calculation," she noted. "As I said, you taught me well." "It was a lie." He stepped closer, moving under the edge of the umbrella. The proximity forced her to look up at him. "It was a lie I told myself to justify the worst thing I've ever done. And I have paid for it. Every single day for the last year, I have lived in a graveyard." "You want absolution," she observed, her voice devoid of pity. "You are standing in the rain, ruining your boots, because your conscience is heavy, and you want me to absolve you. You want me to say, 'I forgive you,' so you can go back to your cold, empty house and finally sleep." "No," he said fiercely. "I don't want your forgiveness. I don't deserve it." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to look at me." "I am looking at you." "No, you aren't." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, desperate to touch her cheek, to wipe away the cold rain that was beginning to blow under the umbrella. He forced his hand down, gripping the carriage door tighter. "You're looking at a ghost. You've buried me, Cecilia." "But I am not dead." She stared at him. The rain hammered against the silk of the umbrella above them, a deafening drumbeat. For a long, excruciating moment, the silence between them was louder than the storm. Then she leaned in. She closed the distance between them until he could feel the warmth of her breath against his cold, wet skin. "You are right," she whispered, her voice a lethal, silken thread. "You are not dead. But the girl you broke, the girl who would have starved in the streets with you, the girl who begged you to let her help you bear the weight." She tilted her head, her grey eyes locking onto his with an intensity that burned. "She is dead, Nathaniel. She drowned in the rain a year ago. I am what climbed out of the water." She reached up. Her gloved hand grasped his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She didn't push him away. She simply peeled his fingers off the carriage door, one by one. The physical contact, the first in a year, sent a jolt of electricity straight to his heart. But her touch was freezing. "And I," she continued, her voice dropping to a final devastating whisper, "do not negotiate with cowards." She let go of his hand. She stepped up into the carriage and sat back into the shadows of the velvet interior. "Drive," she commanded. The footman slammed the door shut, narrowly missing Nathaniel's arm. He jumped up onto the back of the carriage. The driver snapped the reins, and the heavy horses lurched forward, their hooves striking sparks against the wet cobblestones. Nathaniel stood in the street. The carriage rolled away, its wheels splashing through deep puddles, shrinking into the grey curtain of the rain. He didn't move. The rain pounded against his shoulders, soaking him to the bone, but he felt nothing but a terrifying, brilliant clarity. She was right. The girl he knew was gone. He had killed her. He had forged this cold, ruthless queen in the fires of his own betrayal. She was untouchable, fortified by wealth, and guarded by absolute apathy. He wiped the rain from his eyes, staring down the empty street. Absolution was impossible. Forgiveness was a fairy tale. If he wanted any part of her in his life, he couldn't apologize his way back in. He couldn't rely on the ghost of their past affection. He would have to tear down the fortress she had built. He would have to match her ruthlessness. He would have to go to war, not to defeat her, but to prove he was strong enough to stand beside the monster he had created. Nathaniel turned and began to walk back toward his empty, ruined house. He was bankrupt. He was humiliated. He was soaked. But for the first time in a year, his heart was beating. Nathaniel could not outbid the Marlowe syndicate. He did not have the capital, the credit, or the leverage on the exchange. If he fought Cecilia in the financial sector, she would crush him beneath a mountain of gold. So he changed the battlefield. He had one weapon left that her father's merchant money could not buy, a hereditary seat in the House of Lords. The aristocracy might be bleeding cash, but they still wrote the laws. For 3 weeks, Nathaniel did not sleep. He haunted the velvet-lined corridors of Parliament. He cornered old men in the smoky reading rooms of private clubs. He called in century-old debts owed to the Hastings name. He leveraged his title with a ruthless, predatory focus that shocked his peers. The Duke of Westford, historically a silent, brooding presence on the back benches, suddenly became a political terror. He learned the Marlowe supply chain inside and out. He found the chink in the armor. Cecilia's newly acquired tin mines in Cornwall were useless if the ore couldn't be transported cheaply to the northern foundries. She relied on a proposed expansion of the West India docks and a new railway subsidiary bill currently moving through the Lords. Nathaniel didn't just oppose the bills, he butchered them. He rallied the Conservative Lords, feeding their deep-seated fear of new industrial wealth usurping their power. He drafted amendments mandating aggressive environmental inspections of the tin shipments. He proposed tariffs on the specific rail gauges the Marlowe syndicate used. He built a legislative blockade made of red tape, tradition, and aristocratic spite. It cost him every ounce of goodwill he possessed. He traded favors he couldn't afford to repay. He was burning his family's political capital to the ground. He didn't care. He watched the shipping reports in the daily papers. Within 14 days, Marlowe stock dipped. Ships sat idle in the harbor, waiting for clearances that never came. The Cornwall mines operated at a loss. He was choking her empire. He waited. He knew she wouldn't send a broker this time. You didn't send a clerk to dismantle a duke in his own house. On a Tuesday evening, as Nathaniel sat in his study, staring at a ledger that proved he was precisely 2 months away from absolute insolvency, the heavy brass knocker on the front door of Westford House echoed through the empty halls. He didn't move. He listened to the slow, shuffling footsteps of his elderly butler, Bates, crossing the marble foyer. The heavy oak door groaned open. A low exchange of voices drifted down the corridor. A moment later, Bates appeared in the doorway of the study. He looked pale. "Your Grace," the old man said, his voice trembling slightly. "Miss Marlowe is in the drawing room." Nathaniel closed the ledger. The loud snap of the heavy leather covers sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. His heart began a slow, heavy, thunderous rhythm against his ribs. "Did you offer her tea, Bates?" "She declined, Your Grace. She requested you." Bates hesitated. "She is She did not bring a chaperone, sir, and her footman is waiting outside. It is highly irregular." "Everything about this is irregular," Nathaniel said, standing up. He didn't check his reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. He didn't adjust his cravat. He walked out of the study and down the long, dim corridor. The house was cold. He had ordered the fires kept low to save on coal. The walls, once lined with expensive tapestries and ancestral portraits, were conspicuously bare in places. The faded rectangles on the wallpaper marked where he had sold off his heritage to fund his legislative war. He reached the drawing-room doors and pushed them open. Cecilia stood by the window, her back to him. She was wearing a travelling coat of dark, heavy wool, entirely unsuited for a social call. The room was shrouded in twilight, the furniture draped in holland covers to protect them from dust, giving the space the appearance of a graveyard filled with rectangular ghosts. She turned as he entered. The impenetrable mask of bored indifference was gone. In its place was a sharp, focused, lethal intensity. She looked at the bare walls, the covered furniture, the unlit hearth. "I see the rumors are true," she said, her voice echoing off the high, bare ceiling. "You are completely ruined." "I am liquidating non-essential assets," Nathaniel replied, walking further into the room. He did not offer her a seat. "You sold the Rubens in the foyer." I found the cherubs overly sentimental. She narrowed her eyes. The air between them felt pressurized, heavy with unspoken violence. "The dock expansion bill has been tabled indefinitely. The customs inspections on my Cornwall trains are taking 3 weeks. My brokers tell me Lord Preston personally introduced the tariff amendment. Preston owes my family a favour regarding a rather ugly scandal in his youth. I collected. You are disrupting £20,000 of commerce. I am fulfilling my duty as a peer of the realm," he said, holding her gaze, "to ensure responsible industrial growth. You are committing political suicide." She took a step toward him. The heels of her boots clicked sharply on the hardwood floor. "You have alienated your allies. You have spent whatever pathetic capital you had left. For what? To stall my shipments for a month? I will find another route, Nathaniel. I will buy a different port. I will build my own railway if I have to. You cannot outlast me." "Perhaps not," he agreed softly. "But I have your attention." Cecilia stopped. Her chest rose and fell in a sharp, shallow breath. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the old window panes. "My attention," she repeated, the words dripping with contempt. "You burned down your own house just so I would look at the smoke?" "Yes." She stared at him, genuinely appalled. "You are insane." "I am desperate." Nathaniel closed the distance between them, ignoring the warning flash in her grey eyes. He stopped an arm's length away. "You told me you didn't negotiate with cowards. You told me you felt nothing when you bought the Ashdown lease. You were just a machine, removing an obstacle. And I meant it. Then why are you here?" he countered, his voice rising, bouncing off the covered furniture. "Send your lawyers, send your lobbyists, bribe Preston, buy the committee. That is what the machine does. But you didn't do that. You walked into my house to tell you to your face that you have failed," she snapped, her composure fracturing at the edges. "To look you in the eye and tell you that your pathetic, desperate attempt to play the Baron has done nothing but guarantee your own starvation. You're lying. I hold the debts to this estate, Nathaniel. I bought them 3 days ago." Her voice cracked like a whip. "The creditors in the city sold them to me for pennies on the pound because they know you are finished. I own the roof over your head. I own the floor you are standing on. I could have the bailiffs throw you into the street tomorrow morning." The revelation hit him, a cold, heavy stone dropping into his stomach. She had bought his debts. He was entirely, legally at her mercy. He looked around the dim, grand, decaying room. He looked at the woman standing in the center of it, vibrating with a fury she was desperately trying to suppress. A slow, exhausted smile touched his lips. "Then do it," he whispered. Cecilia flinched as if he had struck her. "What?" "Do it," Nathaniel repeated, louder this time. He stepped closer, crowding her space, shedding the last remnants of aristocratic propriety. "Throw me out. Call the bailiffs. Take the house. Take the title. Take it all. I don't care." She took a step back, her eyes wide, searching his face for the bluff. She found none. "You did this to save this estate," she breathed, pointing a gloved finger at the floor. "You ruined us to save this, and I was wrong." The shout tore from his throat, raw and brutal, echoing into the high vault of the ceiling. "I was wrong, Cecilia. Look at it. Look at what I saved." He gestured violently around the desolate room. "It's dust. It's stone and ledger ink. I sacrificed the only living, breathing thing in my life for a museum that was already dead. You think you can hurt me by taking it away? You can't. You can't take anything from me that I didn't already destroy a year ago." He stopped, his chest heaving, the adrenaline burning through his veins. Cecilia was staring at him. The ice in her eyes had shattered. She wasn't the bored, untouchable queen of the London Exchange anymore. The severe posture slumped. The tight, controlled lines of her face gave way to a sudden, devastating vulnerability. "You left me in the rain," she whispered. Her voice broke, a jagged, ragged sound that cut through Nathaniel's heart like a rusted blade. "I know. You told me I was a distraction." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. The dark wool of her coat trembled. "You looked at me like I was nothing." I was terrified. "I loved you," she screamed. She lunged forward. She hit him. Her fists slammed against his chest, hard and uncoordinated. He didn't step back. He didn't try to catch her wrists. He stood there, planted like a ruin, and let her strike him. "I loved you, and you threw me away like I was garbage," she sobbed, hitting his shoulders, his chest, anywhere she could reach. "You killed me. You killed the girl who loved you." Every blow was a relief. Every physical strike was a confirmation that she was alive, that beneath the marble and the money and the ice, the fire was still burning. She hit him again, a glancing blow to his collarbone, and then a ragged sob tore free from her throat. Her knees gave out. Nathaniel caught her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest as she collapsed against him. She fought him for a second, pushing against his shoulders, but the fight drained out of her instantly, replaced by a year's worth of suppressed, suffocating grief. She buried her face in the rough wool of his coat and wept. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic cry. It was an ugly, desperate, visceral mourning. She gripped his lapels as if she were drowning in a violent sea, and he was the only wreckage she could hold on to. Nathaniel closed his eyes, resting his chin on the top of her head. He buried his face in the scent of bergamot and smoke. His own vision blurred, hot tears slipping down his face and disappearing into her hair. He held her in the cold, empty drawing room of a bankrupt estate. The silence of the house pressed in around them, but for the first time in 365 days, the deafening, hollow roar in his own chest was quiet. The storm outside finally broke, the wind dying down to a low, mournful howl against the stone facade of Westford House. Cecilia's crying had slowed to exhausted, shuddering breaths. She didn't pull away. She remained pressed against him, her face hidden in his coat. Nathaniel hadn't loosened his grip. He was terrified that if he let go, the illusion would shatter, the ice would return, and she would walk out the door. Slowly she lifted her head. Her grey eyes were bloodshot, the severe, perfect paint on her lips smudged and ruined. She looked entirely human. She looked beautiful. She placed her hands flat against his chest and pushed gently. He released her, letting his arms drop to his sides, his hands feeling instantly, agonizingly empty. Cecilia took a step back, wrapping her arms around her own waist, shivering in the chill of the unlit room. She looked at the floor between them. "I bought the debts out of spite," she admitted, her voice raspy and thick. "I wanted to hold the deed to this house and burn it in front of you." "I will provide the matches," Nathaniel said quietly. She looked up at him, a flicker of sad, tired disbelief in her eyes. "You don't mean that. This is your legacy. It's 500 years of history." "My history is a ledger of mistakes," he replied, taking a slow step toward her. He didn't want to crowd her, but the distance felt intolerable. "My father died trying to outrun it. I died trying to preserve it. I don't want it anymore, Cecilia. You hold the paper. Take the house. Take the mines. I yield." She searched his face. "If I take it all, what do you have left?" "Nothing," he said simply. "Absolutely nothing." He paused, swallowing the heavy knot in his throat. "Except the truth, which is that I made a calculation based on fear, and I lost the only thing of value I ever possessed." He held her gaze, stripping away the last of his pride, laying himself entirely bare. "I am not asking for the girl in the rain back. I know I killed her, and I know you don't need me. You have built an empire that makes this estate look like a dollhouse. You are terrifying, and you are brilliant, and you are ruthless." A faint, trembling breath hitched in her chest. "I don't have a title to offer you that means anything anymore," Nathaniel continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't have wealth. I don't have honor. But if the woman who climbed out of that water will have me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a man worthy of the monster you had to become to survive me." Cecilia stared at him. The shadows of the room seemed to lengthen, holding their breath. She didn't offer him a soft smile. She didn't throw her arms around his neck and declare the past forgotten. They were both too damaged, too deeply scarred by the warfare of the last year to pretend they could step back into the innocence they had lost. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her heavy wool coat. She pulled out a thick, folded sheaf of legal parchment. It bore the heavy wax seals of the city's largest banking firm. The deeds, the debts, the absolute ownership of Nathaniel's ruin. She looked at the papers, then looked at him. "My father," she said, her voice steadying, regaining a fraction of its former steel, "believes I bought these to consolidate our land holdings. He expects me to foreclose by the end of the quarter." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Then you should do what is best for the syndicate." Cecilia walked slowly to the massive, unlit fireplace. She stood before the cold, black grate. "The syndicate," she said, looking at the soot-stained bricks, "requires stability. It requires allies in Parliament. It does not require a rotting, bankrupt manor house." She turned back to face him. She held up the heavy parchment. With a slow, deliberate motion, she gripped the top edge of the documents with both hands and tore them in half. The thick paper ripped with a loud, violent sound that echoed off the bare walls. She placed the halves together and tore them again. Nathaniel watched, paralyzed, as she dropped the shredded remains of his ruin into the cold ashes of the fireplace. "I don't want your house, Nathaniel," she said, wiping the dust from her dark leather gloves. "I have my own." She walked back to him. She didn't stop an arm's length away. She stepped into his space, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She reached up, resting a single hand against the side of his jaw. Her thumb brushed over the rough stubble on his cheek. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of ownership. "Lift the blockade in the Lords tomorrow morning," she commanded, her grey eyes locking onto his, clear, sharp, and intensely alive. or I will bury you in the press by Friday." Nathaniel felt a sudden, fierce, tearing sensation in his chest. It felt like a heartbeat, a real, heavy, violent heartbeat. He raised his hand, covering hers where it rested against his face. He pressed his palm against her knuckles. "You can try," he murmured, a genuine, cynical, broken smile finally touching his lips. Cecilia didn't smile back, but the corners of her eyes softened, acknowledging the challenge, acknowledging the truth of what they were. They were bruised, they were bitter, and they were entirely, irrevocably bound to one another. "Come to my office on Threadneedle Street tomorrow at noon," she said softly. "We have the future of a tin mine to discuss. I will be there." She didn't kiss him. She didn't say she loved him. She didn't need to. They had burned the fairy tale to the ground, and what was left in the ashes was something far stronger, forged in iron and ledger ink. She lowered her hand, stepped around him, and walked out of the drawing room. Nathaniel stood alone in the dark. He listened to the heavy oak door close, shutting out the storm. For the first time in a year, the Duke of Westford looked around his empty, ruined house and felt absolutely wealthy. If the tension, the betrayal, and the ruthless path to redemption in this story kept you reading until the very last word, you know what to do. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with anyone who loves a dark, slow-burn historical romance, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep, dramatic storytelling. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Nathaniel truly earned his redemption? Or did Cecilia let him off too easily? Sound off below, and I'll see you in the next story.